My name's Glenn Brown. I'm a Googler. I'm a product counsel. I work on image search and video and Blogger and Wi-Fi and some other things. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Creative Commons, who's down from San Francisco. I worked at Creative Commons for 3 years before joining Google a couple of years ago. And we're going to hear a little bit about what Creative Commons has been up to recently and what their plans are for the future, and what Googlers can do to help out Creative Commons, both as part of Google and maybe outside. We're going to talk mostly about technical aspects of Creative Commons and some of the technical tools they have that help people who create online media and different kinds of works online to share them under a some rights reserved copyright, under a less restrictive copyright than the general default rules of copyright allow. Just a quick sense of how many people here already knew of Creative Commons before coming to the Tech Talk or know something about it. Okay, good. So we can assume a good level of knowledge about Creative Commons. So again, this talk will be, I think, mostly focused on technical stuff and tools. Then we're going to have a little movie that Creative Commons is going to show, and then there'll be time for some Q&A. And we've got the whole Creative Commons staff here, from lawyers to designers to business people. So if you have questions during the presentation or at the end, there'll be time for that. But I now want to introduce you to the main speaker, who's Mike Linksvayer, who's the CTO of Creative Commons. And I had the pleasure of working with Mike for 2.5 of the years I was at Creative Commons, and he's now the longest serving staff member at Creative Commons. He's been around since April of 2003, I think, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about what they're doing now and different ways that, that you all can help out. So I'll hand it over to Mike now.
Thank you. Am I? Hello? Okay, that's good. So from Blogger to YouTube, or from analytics to Zeitgeist, I couldn't think of any relevant Google products that spanned A to Z. And analytics and Zeitgeist are kind of meta. And then Google, of course, famous for web search, but really spanning all of the company's businesses. Overly restrictive copyright potentially impacts every single one of those businesses. And Creative Commons is part of the solution. Do you want to work together? So the purpose of this talk, as Glenn said, is mainly going to be technical. And I want to stimulate thought and innovation, feedback and implementations. And there are some technical details I'm just going to be straight up asked for feedback and opinion on. Inspiration would be a happy coincidence, but I'm not promising it, because the inspirer is in Berlin. And this is my terribly cheesy attempt to imitate his slides, because he sometimes uses the opening and closing bracket. That's Lawrence Lessig, our founder. He spoke here to a much bigger audience, I think, last year, and will get you worked up about free culture. In order to work together, we could get creative. This is our original movie released in 2002 that describes Creative Commons in a fair amount of detail in the background of how
These are Jack and Mick.
Okay, well, that's enough of that. That cartoon, I highly recommend you watch it and show it to your friends who don't know anything about copyright and how copyright works on the internet or fails to work. We have a new cartoon that I'm going to show you, and this is the first semi-public showing of it, period. That's a little more succinct and a little more fun. It's a few minutes long.
When you share your creativity, you're enabling people anywhere to use it, learn from it, and be inspired by it. Take the teacher who shapes young minds with work and wisdom from around the globe, and the artist who builds beauty out of bits and pieces she finds online, and the writer whose stories use ideas and images crafted by people he's never even met. These people know that when you share your creative wealth, you can accomplish great things. They and millions of other people all around the planet are working together to build a richer, better, more vibrant culture using Creative Commons. To understand Creative Commons, you need to know a little bit about how copyright works. Did you know that when you create something, anything, from a photograph to a song, to a drawing, to a film, to a story, you automatically own an all rights reserved copyright to that creativity? It's true. Copyright protects your creativity against uses you don't consent to. But sometimes full copyright is too restrictive. What about when you want all those millions and millions of people out there to use your work without the hassle of coming to you for permission? What if you want your work to be freely shared, reused, and built upon by the rest of the world? Luckily, there's an answer. Creative Commons. We provide free copyright licenses you can use to tell people exactly which parts of your copyright you're happy to give to the public. It's easy. It only takes a minute, and it's totally free. Just come to our website and answer a few quick questions like, will you allow commercial uses of your work? And will you allow your work to be modified? Based on your answers, we'll give you a license that clearly communicates what people can and can't do with your creativity. You don't give up your copyright. You refine it so it works better for you. Welcome to a new world where collaboration rules. It didn't even exist just a few years ago, but now there are millions and millions of songs, pictures, videos, and written works available to share, reuse, and remix, all for free. Want to work together? Then join the Commons. Creative Commons.
So I think I blew the segue maybe, but that video is called Want to Work Together. And there was one joke that I wanted to tell before, sorry. The inspirer, it's better to have an inspirer than a decider, I figure. So first I'm gonna just throw out some, what I call chum, and chum is of course blood and body parts of fish that's used to feed sharks. This is going to be non-technical, but just some fun things to think about so you can tell your non-technical friends or argue with them about something. So what are some ways to think about Creative Commons? Well, one is the way we usually frame it is reasonable, flexible copyright. Another way is lowering transaction costs. You can think of it as in terms of free speech, cultural environmentalism. And if you Google any of these terms, you'll find some interesting papers. And then you can also think of it in terms of free Libre or open source software. And I'll just say open source from now on, but in case anybody prefers the other terms, you can use those. And for this audience, I'm going to do a couple of quick illustrations of the relation to open source. So open source, you can think of as being the green circle in the middle, and some Creative Commons licenses fit within those principles. And the kind of recycling-like symbol is share alike, so that's our version of copyleft. And then the by is attribution, you have to give credits. And then there are other things that fall, there are other license conditions that fall outside of the scope of what would be considered open source, such as no derivatives and non-commercial or commercial use is prohibited. And just a thought, maybe media is 20 years behind software. And that's one of the reasons why we need those options. And then another interesting thing to think about as well, you've got code and media licenses, and maybe there's a tiny bit of overlap now, and there's a bunch of stuff that's not copyrightable at all. And maybe in the future, the overlap will get bigger. And in the future, maybe nothing will be uncopyrightable because everything will be fixed when you think it. So interesting thing about reuse. I think a lot of programmers, when they think about code and content, they think, well, there's an obvious pragmatic case for code reuse. But interesting thing about it is that it's only applicable in very specific cases. If you have a Python library and you're writing, a program in Java, chances are you're going to have to re-implement. You're not going to be able to directly reuse, although maybe with Python that's not the case. But anyway, but in arts, not invented here is not a bad thing. So there's not a pragmatic case for reuse always. But on the other hand, any arts can conceivably be mixed with any other arts. So content license interoperability is as important as code license interoperability, even though there are different use cases. So there are a bunch of different kinds of interoperability that Creative Commons is interested in. I have no idea what interoperability between code and media really means. You guys are smart. Maybe you can daydream about that someday. And there's media licenses, there's R licenses, and the licenses used by Wikipedia. There's no reason there should be separate silos of contents. I don't know if we have any way to solve that problem, but it's something that Larry Lessig and Evan Moglin of the FSF have talked about. If you're really interested in this stuff, you can listen to their talk at that was at Wikimania at that link. And then across jurisdictions, this is something that Creative Commons has been doing from the beginning. It's for real. Creative Commons has been ported to 30-some odd jurisdictions. So that's the end of the stuff that I have no idea what I'm talking about, and just things for you to talk about with your non-technical friends. Almost, except this is all real. So I just want to give you a quick update on some legal stuff we're doing, or sort of legal stuff. That's the tilde in front of it. We've got the Podcasting Legal Guide, which is, of course, a guide to podcasters and what kind of rules you have to follow, both for incorporating Creative Commons content and how to deal with copyright generally. What does non-commercial mean? Which is probably the biggest controversy, because we have a non-commercial license, and it's not always cut and dry what exactly a commercial use is. We have a page of critiques and controversies. We're all about being open. And you can check out a bunch of articles on the wiki page mentioned there. We've actually had a couple of cases where a Creative Commons license was involved. They're both in Europe, but they're kind of interesting. And you can read all about them at the URL here. Kind of interesting because one was a case of Creative Commons licensed content being misused or outside of the scope of the license, and that was upheld. And another was Creative Commons content was being properly used, and someone tried to prevent that use, and it was upheld also. And then we are working on version 3.0 for our licenses. You can find some information about that at the link there. And then Glenn said you can't just talk about cool stuff. You have to talk about some really cool stuff that's being done with Creative Commons. So I'm going to mention a few of those. One is we have a site called CCMixter, which I'll show you very briefly. You've probably all heard about Lonely Girl 15 on YouTube. Some mixes by a user on CCMixter were used in those videos and got seen by hundreds of thousands of people. And Pat Chella, the artist or remixer, has since signed a commercial deal with that operation. Something cool, according to Glenn's taste, I think, we recently had a benefit concert in New York City with Diplo, Girl Talk, and Peeping Tom. Something cool, according to my taste, Bob Ostertag, a very important electronic composer, released all of his 20 years of audio work under a CC license earlier this year. So what about yours? Well, the problem is, there's no accounting for taste. And there's a huge amount of stuff that's Creative Commons licensed out there, much of it very awesome. So that's one reason, one of my kind of peeves or goals, I guess, is that discovery is a really important thing, from collaborative filtering to just conversation. And a bunch of other cool stuff. Second live concert with Jonathan Coulton, a board game, audiobook remix contest, remix, a museum in Boston releasing classical music under CC license, a Brazilian movie released simultaneously in theaters and online under CC, Dig Nation and other podcasts. We have salons in San Francisco and a bunch of other cities around the world. And there's just so much more going on. As will come up when I talk about some of the technical stuff, Creative Commons, both the technical and the community infrastructure is really decentralized. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening that we don't find out about until 6 months later or years later. I mean, just like in real culture. So now I'm going to segue into the technical part of this talk. So in December 2002, we launched, and one of the innovations was that we had 3 separate representations of the licenses. If you think of a code license like the GPL, there's just the GPL, and you can read it if you want to. But very few people will. People now understand the GPL, I think, kind of through osmosis. Very few people have actually read it. So we have 3 representations. One is human readable, so we have icons that describe the conditions associated with the license. So this one, you have to give attribution. Can't use for commercial use, and if you make a derivative work, you have to share alike. Then we also have the actual lawyer readable code. And then we have, more interestingly here, we have machine readable code, which describes both the work being licensed and the license itself. So a machine can discover, is this work licensed? And then what conditions are associated with the license? Oh, and we thought, or I hadn't joined until April 2003, but basically the thought was, this is a really cool feature that could be added to a search engine. Somebody's going to build it, right? Well, it took a little while. In early 2004, we got tired of waiting, I guess, and built a prototype using Postgres, tsearch2, which is a full text indexer for Postgres and Python. And boy, was it ever slow, but it was a good prototype. Then in late 2004, we built a search engine for CC material based on an open source search engine called Nutch, which uses Lucene. If some of you are familiar with Java full text indexing, you might be familiar with that code base, which was an even better prototype and somewhat usable. And then finally, early in 2005, Yahoo built Yahoo Search for CC, in which basically they filter their web index according to materials they think are CC licensed. And then in late 2005, you guys did it, and I hope you don't let them beat you at anything ever again. So then this is the interface we have now. If you go to search.creativecommons.org. So we have a series of tabs that enable you to access search engines that are CC enabled in some fashion. And you can get there either by going to search.creativecommons.org or using the Firefox search dropdown, which most people think is just the Google search bar, I think, but credit to you guys for that. So this is an example search where I'm searching for clip art, and I'm using the Google CC search, basically. So it's only searching the portion of the Google index that is thought to be licensed, under Creative Commons license. And you can see the first hit that comes up is the open clip art library. That's a pretty good hit, because that's a public domain. That's a library of public domain clip art. It doesn't work all that well for some other terms, though. So I'm going to, before we get to other uses of search, I'm going to dive a little bit in technically and talk about our metadata infrastructure that enables this kind of search. So we started out with RDF XML in HTML comments, and what that means is, I'll describe RDF very briefly later, but basically it's a way to put metadata in a web page such that it's invisible to a user and can be copy and pasted into that web page. That's why it has to be in comments, otherwise it would show up as random characters in the web page. And I can show you really quick why that was a requirement for us. If you go to creativecommons.org and click publish, and I choose a license, let's say I want to make other people share alike. Select a license. And I get this block of HTML, which I can put in my templates or my web page or anything that's HTML or even word processors accept it now. We had to be super generic because otherwise, in order to use a CC license, you had to integrate with every single software package. So that's the copy and paste requirement. And so we could have just made up our own XML format and still done that. But the Semantic Web seemed like the way to go. There's a lot of hype around it. However, RDF XML and HTML comments is super ugly. And it may have even been one of the reasons why it took Google a while to build a CC search engine. They're hidden to humans, which means that it's amenable to both spamming and also just ill maintenance. If a webmaster changes their license or changes other metadata, they might forget to change the hidden metadata. It's hidden to XML parsers in a sense because an XML parser can throw out comments. RDF XML is confusing to many people. To be honest, I started using it at another company in 2000, late 2000, I guess, and it literally took me a year or so to really grok it. It's easy to mess up because it's embedded in comments. CMS might escape it. It's more verbose than needed for the information we're conveying. Whoops. And just show you, if you look in this copy and paste little area here, I think you can see here's the beginning of an HTML comment. And that's probably making you cringe. So another metadata format that's new to the scene. And I meant to say something before I started with metadata. This is an area that's really still developing, and there isn't an ideal solution. And because Google, I think one of the ideal things for Creative Commons about Google is because you guys both facilitate publishing, but then also search is kind of the ultimate consumer. So I'll come back to the point later, but so I want both. I want to arrive at standards that Google wants to implement. Is a short version of it. So I want honest feedback. So microformats have taken off in the last year or so. They were initially called Semantic XHTML, basically just leveraging semantic class names that CSS designers already used. And rel equals license is one of the simplest microformats. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But the benefits of microformats are basically that they're co-located with human visible markup, so you don't have the downsides of hidden metadata. They're also very concise, so they're not verbose like all of that XML you saw a second ago. They have a couple of problems. Or the first problem is a problem with rel license by itself, really. It's at the page level. So you can know that a page is licensed, but you can't know if an image inside the page is licensed without using some kind of heuristics. And then also, what about saying that an MP3 I'm linking to is licensed? What about saying an image in the page is licensed or video in the page is licensed, et cetera? And there's some scalability and interoperability questions about microformats. It's a centralized process. You don't need to use namespaces, so it can't really be decentralized. And that's, depending on your perspective you're coming from, that's either plus or minus. And this is what the rel equals license microformat actually looks like. We have a bit of HTML. It says this work is licensed under Creative Commons license, and it links to the license. We just add a rel equals license attribute to that HTML. And that indicates that we're not just linking to the license because it's a cool link, or we're talking about it. We're saying that there's some content here that's licensed. And you can see that documented on the Microformats wiki. That's actually the wrong link. It is actually microformats.org/wiki/rel license. But anyway. Yeah?
Is this out there in the wild already?
Yes. Yes, this is out there in the wild since 2004. Yeah. Yes, and yeah. So what we want is a solution that you can make statements about things, whether it's at the whole page level, or a fragment, or a link in that page, or an embedded object, be it an image, a movie, whatever. And it has the advantages of microformats. It's co-located with, or one of the advantages of microformats. It's co-located with human visible markup. So again, you don't have the problems with hidden metadata. It's publisher and consumer friendly. Basically, that means that it's low impact for publishers and can easily be exposed to consumers or browsers. And then it's flexible and interoperable. So one solution that some people associate with Creative Commons and the W3C have been working on is called RDFA. I'm going to briefly run through what that is. It's an RDF serialization. The A stands for attributes. It's the mythical RDF in HTML that many people have wanted for years, including Creative Commons. That's how we arrived at the crummy RDF in HTML solution. It was developed for, there are some problems with it. It was developed for XHTML2 originally, which nobody uses and nobody probably ever will. It uses the about and property attributes, which are defined for XHTML2, but are invalid in XHTML1. And some people just hate RDF. The solutions are probably going to be a new revision of XHTML1 that's upward compatible. And many of the people, my conjecture is that many of the people who say they hate RDF actually hate RDF XML because that's all they've been exposed to. And you can see ongoing developments about this at rdfa.info. And now I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what that actually looks like. And this is not actually deployed except experimentally, but I'd be keen to hear feedback on it. So we've got this is a simple RDFA example. It looks exactly like the microformat example, but it produces, and in fact, it is exactly the same as the microformat example. But you can think of it as producing what's called a triple or a sentence in RDF. And that code at the bottom, basically, the two square brackets right next to each other represents the current URL, so the current page. And then we're saying that page has a license, and the license is identified by the URI you see there. So I'm going to show you a bigger RDFA example that attacks some of the issues I described before. How do you precisely identify things other than web pages that are licensed? So images, here, this will be an example of an image, and also incorporating other metadata about the image besides license. So the stuff in red, as with the previous microformat and RDFA examples, are the additional metadata added to the HTML. And here we have a span, and the about attribute identifies the subject. So this is the URL we're going to be making statements about. And then the rel and property attributes are verbs or predicates. So these are the type of statements we're going to be making about that URL. And then either the content, or I guess either the content or the href is the object. And so this HTML produces the following triples or the following statements. So this is using an easy to read RDF serialization called N3, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We have an image, a foo.jpg, and we're saying the first line says that it's an image. The second says that it's called foo captured. The third says you're supposed to attribute that image with a link to bobhome.example.org. The fourth says that you should attribute the creator's name as Bob. And then finally, we say that the image is licensed under a particular license. And within a single page, you could annotate any number of images or links to MP3s or whatever with this style of markup. So now I didn't want to try to, for anybody who doesn't know what RDF is, I didn't want to explain it kind of cold. I think it's easier to understand after you've seen some examples. But a super short explanation is that you're making sentences. You've got a subject that's always a URL or a URI. You've got a predicate that's also always a URI. And you've got an object, and that's either a URI or text. So the example of an object is the license, if your predicate is licensed. And you can say a lot of things with those primitives, and you can do a lot of things with what is said, like inferencing. Then a super short explanation of RDFA, which I showed you the demo of. You've got the subject denoted by the about attribute, and if the about is not there, then it defaults to the current document. The predicate is denoted by rel or rev if you want to flip your subject and object around, and it's URI. And the predicate, whoops, typo, I meant, no, it's not a typo. So if you're using a rel, then the object is a URI. If you're using a property attribute, then the object is a literal or just some text. Example of that would be Bob is just some text. So we use the property attribute to denote that. So Benita, who was the first Creative Commons CTO and went on to do a PhD at MIT and is Creative Commons representative on the W3C, has a brief case for RDFA. And if you're interested, I encourage you to go to his page, ben.adida.net/presentations. But he lays out a case comparing RDFA to Microformats, XML, and a couple of other metadata technologies. And the benefits in summary are publisher independence. The creation process is decentralized, so any publisher can come up with their own schema. Data reuse and containment are related, but basically one end user feature you can get with them is copy and paste, because the metadata isn't in a separate file and it's co-located with the human readable HTML. Schema modularity and schema evolvability are really outcomes of decentralization in part. The schemas aren't rigid. You can have statements from different schemas in the same page, for example, and you don't have to know about how to compose them. You can be saying that if you had a schema for describing a museum work of art, and then you also had a way to say that it was licensed, you don't have to worry about how they play together because you're just making statements about URLs. Then I want to throw in a fun semantic web analogy, or at least I think it's fun. Java applets are to Java as COBOL as the semantic web vision and hype in 2001 are to semantic web technologies now being used to integrate heterogeneous enterprise data. And if you get that analogy, then it's great. I hope you'll think it's funny. If not, oh well. But I think the difference might be that while Java applets may never come back on the public web, I think semantic web technologies will. So microformats are worse. And I'm kind of belaboring this sort of pseudo comparison because it's something that I really want engineers' feedback on. So one of the bad things about microformats, or in my view, the worst thing, is the S. There's no consistent model. Every microformat is a new thing. And if you have a parser like the Tails plugin for Firefox, you basically have a bunch of if-then statements. And you need to parse out each individual microformat. So the parsing and knowledge of what the microformat does is tightly coupled. As opposed to RDFA, you've got a model, so you can get a parser can just extract all the triples, and then other software is tasked with deciding what to do with that. There's no deep tools or research. I've already talked about decentralization. The deep tools and research is really if you've seen the semantic web layer cake with inferencing and rules and trust and stuff like that. None of that applies directly to microformats. However, if you haven't seen the essay, Worse is Better, I strongly suggest you read it. Basically, elegant solutions often lose to solutions that do something good right now. And that might be where Microformats is. A lot of people are publishing Microformats for calendar data and contact data, for instance. And their tools being written, however kludgy they are to actually do interesting stuff with Microformats. And there's a potential media info microformat, which would be yet another microformat that, if you wanted to have a universal microformat parser, would be, yet another set of if-then statements or event handlers or whatever. But it could be very useful to Creative Commons to be able to describe chunks of media as opposed to just web pages using microformats. And it doesn't really exist yet, but it's sort of in discussion stages, and there are a couple of URLs there. If you go to the Microformats wiki and search on media, you'll find them. This is a cooked up media info microformat example that incorporates another microformat as well. But basically how microformats work is you've got a class, which designers are familiar with, and you denote that, okay, I'm starting a microformat by using a class name everybody has agreed on. So let's pretend media info. And the stuff in purple is completely made up. There's no existing microformat like this. And then you've got an image here, the famous foo.jpg. And we're saying that with class equals media, or I'm imagining this is how it might work, that this is the media that we're describing within this microformat. And then we're using vcard to say that the creator's name is Bob, and we can use other vcard components to give the URL of the creator and things like that. And then we're also reusing the rel license microformat to say that the media is licensed. And I just want to stress there's no spec like this right now. There is a case to be made for microformats and other kind of non-native RDF metadata to be made interoperable. There's something called Griddle, which stands for Gleaning Resource Descriptions from Dialects of Language. It's basically you associate some XSLT with some metadata, and given knowledge of that metadata, you can get RDF statements out of it. So that way you can take advantage of all of the tools that semantic web researchers are building. But fundamentally, what Creative Commons wants is implementation. We want audio, image, video, search, et cetera, to be CC enabled. And the lack of precise metadata for objects other than web pages has been holding that back. So we're very eager, whether it's RDFA, microformats, or something else, to see something adopted. And obviously, Google is the key adopter. And then also you have people doing CMS and other software, although Google does that as well with Blogger and other properties. And as I just alluded to, Google has chickens and eggs. You both have publishing tools and search, so it can really motivate the adoption of better metadata. So as I've been saying, I want feedback on this. If you want to jump in and contribute, there's discussions for both microformats and RDFA. The one for RDFA is a little bit harder to find, but if you search for RDFA, you can work your way towards the W3C discussion list. And just start, if either of these technologies you find workable, just start implementing them in products and in your own software projects. Then I want to very quickly run through some other technologies of interest to Creative Commons. Embedded metadata, it sucks. This is the metadata that you put inside of a file, like an MP3 or a PDF or whatever. And it almost always sucks. There are crappy standards that are non-extensible, like ID3 for MP3. Everybody who programs against it absolutely hates it. It's almost never exposed in UIs, except for maybe in an MP3 player, you might see the title of the song. It's mostly unused, and there's absolutely no reason to trust it. So there's I'll explain why Creative Commons is interested in this technology that sucks in a second. But there's a somewhat non-crappy standard being pushed by Adobe called XMP. It's extensible. It's basically constrained RDF that can be injected into many different file types, including PDF, JPEG, Flash, and pretty much anything that you can that have an area in the file format to stick junk in. It's from Adobe being built into their product line. It's kind of becoming a standard in high-end digital asset management systems where an ad agency, for example, needs to track its assets. But it's being pushed down to the consumer level. Microsoft is using it in some of its Vista applications. So we're kind of very interested in seeing web applications also support that, web applications that deal with media that aren't web pages. And again, search is an obvious driver for that. And then another reason that embedded metadata sucks is because there's no reason to trust it. Anybody can take a Madonna MP3 and stick a comment in there that says, this is CC licensed, which means nothing because you have no idea. You might get that through email or P2P file sharing network or whatever. You have no reason to trust it. So we say the embedded license is meaningless by itself. It needs a reference to a web page that has the same license information for that media. And in that way, you can kind of trust the embedded license as much as you would as a license assertion on a web page because, in fact, the license assertion is on the web page. And you might not trust license assertion published on GeoCities, so ignore that. You can find a brief write-up of this with some cartoons, actually, on our wiki, the web statement article. So why do we care about embedded metadata? Well, fraudulent use, as I just described, could harm the brand or the trust in our licenses. And fundamentally, objects or works of art, the sort of stuff that Creative Commons is interesting for, are not always shared via the original URL with, or web page with metadata. It could be shared by email, P2P file sharing, being from a wireless device, writable DVD, IM, memory stick, hard drive, pretty much anything. And none of these conveyances have facilities for metadata unless it's in the file itself. And it's also just easier for software to assume the metadata comes with the object in some cases. I've talked to many developers of media players, for example, and even though they realize that ID3 is terrible, they still kind of have the quixotic goal of getting people to put in correct ID3 tags because it's a hell of a lot easier for them to deal with. And chicken and egg, again, is a big problem. So we would like companies like Google to help drive better embedded metadata. And then beyond, we want to do a lot more with metadata than just licenses. There are a lot of complementary things. Attribution is an obvious one. All of the Creative Commons licenses require attribution. And links are web gold, essentially. So you can require somebody to link to your website when they reuse your Creative Commons license content. And I think maybe not having a standard way to attribute with metadata and a link may have been CC's biggest missed opportunity so far because it's not, I don't think it's part of people's consciousness when they think of Creative Commons. This is a way I can tell people to link to me or encourage people to use my content and link back to me. So commerce and nearby, there are a bunch of things related to commerce that we would like people to specify with Creative Commons licenses or along with Creative Commons licenses, such as where can I buy related media, where can I get a commercial license, where can I make a donation, where can I get provenance info. And there's some example. One of the strong things about the Microformats process, as an aside, is that they don't really want to invent brand new formats. They do what's called paving the cow paths. They see how people are already publishing information and then develop and then sort of standardize that. So in the process of looking at microformats, we've started cataloging examples of people doing all of these things on the web at this URL you can see on the screen. And we want to encourage decentralized, meaning aggregator and search-friendly commerce that's complementary to our decentralized public licensing. And also, just when people have commercial success stories and they're using a CC license, that reflects well on us. Occasionally, you'll run into somebody who comes from the publishing industry or just comes from a very strong protectionist background. They think, put a Creative Commons license on your work, that's just a signal to give it away. It's not true because there are conditions attached, but having commerce linked in a complementary fashion reiterates that message. A couple of examples of commerce. We've got Magnatune, a record label using all CC licenses. And you can see they're promoting purchase and commercial licensing. Jamendo, another great curator of CC licensed music, promotes ways to support the artist. All of this could be marked up with metadata as well. Derivatives, this I think is an interesting idea. A lot of people care about who links to them. But as everybody becomes creators and recreators in media besides just web pages, really interested, and people aren't only putting their media in silos. They want to know who on the web is remixing me. So you could imagine a query like instead of link : show me a URL, instead source : meaning show me everybody who has used my work at this URL as source material for their remix. And we kind of have that demonstrated within our own silo, a site called CCMixter. And you can see here's a track from Pat Chell to Beat Gorilla, the guy who worked with Lonely Girl 15, uses samples from a number of tracks and then has been resampled. So all of this could be marked up with metadata to enable a kind of source search. Syndication, you can stick CC licenses in various syndication formats. And this is important for aggregators. And again, Google is the chicken and the egg here. You both have a blog reader and a number of sites that have feeds or allow people to publish feeds. And that's one aside I wanted to make. I'm not really covering here the technologies to give people the option to license their content because they're relatively simple and straightforward. You could add that to Blogger, and we want you to add that to Blogger. There's no technology challenges there, but when it is added to Blogger, an interesting thing would be to also add the appropriate license annotations to the feeds produced by Blogger. So just do it. There are a huge number of areas that Creative Commons would like to see Google build Creative Commons into the product. Blog search is an obvious one. Images is a super obvious one. Video, web search is already there. Blogger, docs and spreadsheets, Picasa, SketchUp, YouTube, and I'm sure I missed some products that either involve content creation or consumption or something in between or both. Then very briefly, we also want people to write open source code that enables Creative Commons in different applications, and I think Google is interested in some of these. OpenOffice is a key one, but also every other content creation package, or simply work to make free software media tools better, and you can go to developer.creativecommons.org for this. And then finally, in that vein, we participated in Summer of Code. We had 3 successful completions. I just want to give a big thank you to Chris DeBona and his team, which we didn't participate last year, but I think it's we're really looking forward to Summer of Code next year. Let's put it that way, because I think it's getting bigger and bigger, and we'll have a ton of influence. Then finally, I want to end on a note asking for your supports, both not only writing code and integrating into products. We're also just started our fall fundraiser, and you can go to creativecommons.org/supports, and you can buy T-shirts there. You can see letters from our founder, Larry Lessig, and please support us in every fashion, because as I said, I think Creative Commons is part of the solution to the restrictive copyright landscape that impacts all of Google's businesses. So thanks, and any questions and answer or feedback, I'd be happy to take.
Let's say thanks to Mike, everybody. Give him a hand. And Now let's open it up to questions, and I just want to remind you that we're videotaping this, and we're going to be putting it on the web, and hopefully under a Creative Commons license. So just kind of be careful about asking questions that have confidential information in them, et cetera.
Also, on that note, you probably want to ask confidential legal questions because we do have our general counsel here and our creative director here. So if you have non-technical questions, please ask those as well.
Great. And just for later, just to remember, there's some free pins and stickers and buttons over there too, if you want to grab them. So, any?
Yeah.
So I saw that the BBC have the creative archive stuff, and they've got a licensing scheme that looks remarkably like yours, where they added their own quickie things to it. And are you in general in support of this, or would you have wanted them to come to you? Question.
Yeah, sure. So Luke is asking about the BBC Creative Archive. They use licenses that look sort of like Creative Commons licenses, but they have, if I could quote, other freaky stuff attached to them. Yeah, so I think that people associated with Creative Commons have been talking to the BBC for a long time, but BBC is funded by UK taxpayers, so I think one of their requirements that unfortunately stood in place was that the content could only be free for UK taxpayers. And there are other things in there, but I'm not, Mia might want to say more. That's about it. Okay.
Do you think it's a missed opportunity, or are you going to...
Let me give you this. It's a little easier to...
Hello? Do you think that's a missed opportunity? And what happens if other organizations start to make their own zoo of licenses that look very much like yours? Is it a concern or something you'd welcome?
It is a concern. I mean, it's a missed opportunity in a sense, but they can only change their mind. Of course, the BBC is a huge organization. Maybe they didn't have very much flexibility. But certainly, I talked a little bit about interoperability at the beginning of the talk. Certainly, a danger is everybody decides to come up with their own licenses, and they're not interoperable. And that reduces the value of freeing content up a lot, because if the licenses are not compatible for some minor reason, then you have these different silos of content. It's bad enough now we have kind of Wikipedia under the FDL and everything else under Creative Commons licenses, but if you have BBC, universities try to come up with their own licenses. Unfortunately, we've been very successful with like OpenCourseWare, and its follow-ons are using CC licenses. So it's a danger, yeah. Any other questions? Anybody wants to tell me how much they hate RDF or love it or anything like that?
Well, can I remind you that this is being broadcast, though?
Okay.
Yes, I hate it.
All right, so thanks once again to Creative Commons and Mike, and the Creative Commons folks will be around if you have any one-on-one questions that you want to ask off camera or exchange business cards or anything like that. And again, there's free pins and stickers and flyers describing Creative Commons stuff sitting here, so grab a handful. And thanks again to Mike. Thanks for coming, everybody.